family.
Sorry.
Why are you crying?
I told you we put it in too early.
Oh, it's just a little dry.
How many of you were in charge of cooking the turkey this past week for Thanksgiving? Anyone? I put my hand up just as an example. I was not in charge of cooking anything. I bought one of those $4 pies in the frozen section at Wegmans. Anyone have an experience like that? No? All right, I'll share a little funny story. My wife's not here. She comes to the second service. I'll share this now. She was in charge of the mashed potatoes. And normally we do our mashed potatoes like by the box. We were going to do homemade mashed potatoes. She did it in the crock pot, put them in for 4 hours. She goes to mash them, and they weren't quite soft enough. So she got the cardio workout of a lifetime trying to mash these mashed potatoes. She was literally doing it for like 45 minutes an hour. I helped too, just in case you're thinking like I was just watching football. I only watched football the first half. She's mashing it like crazy, and then we get to Thanksgiving dinner, and first person who takes a bite, don't think these are done yet. So it was kind of funny, but we are not going to do mashed potatoes in the crock pot again, and our family's definitely not going to put us in charge of the turkey. But we've been in this series called What Happy Families Know, and I think we didn't really think about this when we were planning the series out, but it was kind of great timing because this is the time of year when we are with our family maybe more than any other time of the year. Immediate family might be one thing, but this is a time, I don't know about you, but for me, this is a time where I see extended family, maybe that I only see once or twice a year. I see them all a couple times in this month span. We got Thanksgiving this past week. Christmas is right around the corner if you do anything for New Year's. So I think the timing worked out pretty good. And if you missed any of the past messages for the series, I would encourage you to go back and watch them. All of our messages are online at onechurchny.com. But Pastor Rick, he talked about change the first week, talking about how like change is inevitable. We have to be changing in our family system, and he walked us through how to do that. He talked about keeping the first thing first and how to prioritize God in our lives and in our families. Last week, he talked about parenting. And this week, I want to talk about couples. I want to talk about mainly today in the context of marriage. But if you're single, if you're dating, if you're engaged, maybe you're even widowed and marriage is not even on your radar, I would encourage you to stay tuned because this message can be applied to you regardless of where you are in life. Because what we're going to be talking about, some of the systems we're going to be talking about can leak into other areas and other relationships in our lives as well, maybe with other family members, maybe with friends. But if you were ever to do premarital counseling with me, this is maybe 90% of the concepts that I would talk about. Something that I wish I would have learned several years ago when I first entered into marriage. I've been married for 8.5 years to my lovely wife, Danielle, who's not that good at making potatoes, but is great at making everything else shine in the world. But I wish I would have learned this concept years ago. The first couple years it took me to learn this. And really, a guy named Andy Stanley, who's a pastor of a church in Atlanta, Georgia, is the one that kind of taught me this concept watching some of the teaching that he did. But the bottom line is that every single one of us has a box of hopes, dreams, and desires. Now, if you are dating, the box might be a little bit undefined at the moment. If you're single, you may not even really know what's inside of your box. You're still trying to figure it out. If you're engaged, you probably have a pretty good idea of what is in your box of hopes, dreams, and desires. And if you're married, I'm just hoping that you've talked about your spouse's hopes, dreams, and desires before. But I'd be willing to bet that not everyone has. Because have you ever heard of a friend or a family member who's gone through a divorce and maybe the reason they gave is we just wanted different things. We just wanted different things. And by the way, this is not just a non-Christian problem. A lot of people think that Christian, like the divorce rate that Pastor Rick talked about a few weeks ago is a non-Christian issue. Well, the truth is that the highest rate of divorce is actually in the Bible belts. Atheists have a lower divorce rate than Christians have. So this is more than just a Christian or non-Christian issue. This is a person issue. This is a relationship issue. But we all have these boxes of hopes, dreams, and desires. And inside of these boxes, we have things like money. Now, I only have $8 here, so don't rob me after the service. But inside of our boxes, we have, whether it's from the way we saw our families handle money growing up, whether it's just maybe what we've always hoped that how we would handle money as a couple one day. We have hopes, dreams, and desires. Maybe you're someone who listens to Dave Ramsey all the time, and your hope, dream, and desire is to budget and to live below your means. And maybe for you, it's like you want to just spend as much as possible and buy all the good things. Maybe for you had this idea that you would be a stay-at-home dad or a stay-at-home mom, and your wife or your husband would make all the money, and you could just take care of the home. So there's things like money in our box of hopes, dreams, and desires. There's things like, I just had to buy this and make it work because this is like the silliest toy. But there's things like shopping. I'll be honest, my mom did all the grocery shopping growing up, so I just assumed that my wife would love to grocery shop when we got married, and that was not the case. We have things like, this is an important one, like, are we going to have a dog or are we going to have a cat? And not everything in this box is deal breakers, but I'm telling you, this is a deal breaker. We have things like what kind of car we're going to drive. This is a Corvette Stingray. This is what I thought I was going to drive when I got married, and learned that that's not necessarily the case. We have hopes, dreams, and desires about travel. Maybe you wanted to just see the world and go to Europe and Australia, and your spouse is more of a homebody. They want to just do staycations, and they want to see more of the United States. So that we all have different hopes, dreams, and desires when it comes to that. This is a big one, and hopefully we've all talked about this one before getting too far into a relationship. But we talk about the kids, right? Are we going to have kids? Are we going to have one kid, 2 kids? Are we going to have 3 kids? A pair of behaved young boys. We've all talked about this. We've all had hopes, dreams, and desires. I just assumed when I got married that I would do anything that required a hammer and would be outside, and my wife would do all the, keep the house clean, do all the cooking. That has not been the case. And then, guys, we all have hopes, dreams, and desires of what our spouse will wear to bed, right? And ladies, you're thinking, hey, if he can wear gym shorts and a 10-year-old t-shirt to bed, I can be comfortable too. But and there's other things too, like calendar, how we spend our time. Isn't it true that for if you're a young married couple, maybe the most stressful thing that you've ever had to figure out is how to spend the holidays? Do we spend it? Do we split it? Do we do every other? That can be a stressful thing. There's other things that I can't necessarily put in the box, like sex. Some of you guys thought it was like brushing your teeth every day, twice a day, just to keep everyone healthy. Maybe conflict resolution, like how are we going to resolve conflict? Are we going to talk about it? Are we going to just sweep it under the rug? Are we going to yell it out? Like, how are we going to resolve conflict? The bottom line is we all have these boxes of hopes, dreams, and desires. We enter relationships with them. We build them, and we'll talk about where we kind of got them from. But there's something that happens. It's like when we get married, we stand at the altar, and it's us. We're saying our vows to our spouse, but it's not only us. We kind of subconsciously have this box of hopes, dreams, and desires, and as we're saying our vows, it's almost as if we're just handing our box to our spouse, and we're like, here you go. Here's the box of hopes, dreams, and desires, and somewhere over the course of the next 12 months, these boxes of hopes, dreams, and desires slowly turn into expectations. And if we're not careful, these things that started off as these innocent hopes, dreams, and desires slowly turn into expectations and a burden for our spouse. So we'll talk about how they turn into expectations and what to do with that in just a moment. But there are things that impact what is inside of our box. A couple of those things are, one of them is what we've seen and heard. You could go ahead and fill that in your notes. Maybe your friend just has the best marriage you've ever seen. And maybe as you've been engaged, you're dating someone, and you look at this marriage as an example and just say, if I could only have a marriage like that, and you kind of take things that you see in their marriage and you start to add it to your box of hopes, dreams, and desires. You add it to your box of expectations. Girls, have you ever read a Nicholas Sparks book? I mean, we can sometimes add things we've seen in the media, we read in books, we see in movies, and we add it. Like, we just want to live on the coast of North Carolina and write things down in a notebook. I was practicing that one all week. So we all have different things that we've seen and heard. The other thing is the things that impact our boxes, things that we've experienced. How our parents dealt with relationships made an impression on us for better or for worse. Some of us, our parents, have amazing relationships, and growing up, we always thought, if I could just find someone who treats me the way that my dad treats my mom, or the way that my mom treats my dad, if only I could obtain that. And then there's others of us who our parents didn't have the greatest relationship growing up. Maybe they were separated when we were young, and we always thought, I need to have a better relationship than what I saw modeled at home. Or different things that we see at home. For example, my wife, one of the things that she went through when she was younger and growing up is her parents didn't have a lot of money. There were years where the only clothes that they owned were things that they got from the Salvation Army. There was a year that they weren't going to get any Christmas presents because their parents just couldn't afford it. And they weren't going to get any Christmas presents, but an anonymous person at their church dropped off a barrel of presents for them so they could have a Christmas, and they could have some Christmas presents that year. So what you find in my wife's box of hopes, dreams, and desires is things like financial stability. She always wanted to be able to drive a car that wasn't breaking down every single week, something that she wasn't embarrassed to be in. She wanted to do a budget from day one and wanted to be smart and to save because of what she's experienced. And it doesn't just have to be our experience growing up. It could be our past relationships as well. If you were in a long-term relationship or divorce, your box is going to be shaped by the things that were done well and the things that were done wrong in your past relationship. So again, what happens is as we're committed to this relationship, as we're moving forward, it starts as a box of hopes, dreams, and desires. And hopes, dreams, and desires are always pointed to the future, pointed to something we want. But when we're not careful and it starts to become expectations, the timeline changes. It goes from something that's pointed to the future, these hopes, to something that we expect. And the timeline is now. It's the present. We start to expect these things now. And this is what really happens, and you could fill this in, is that the problem is attempting to recreate or avoid something from the past transforms our hopes, dreams, and desires into expectations. I love this definition of expectations. Andy Stanley came up with this one. He said, the strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. See, the big difference between hopes, dreams, and desires are hopes, dreams, and desires, when they're not met, we don't get too worked up by them. Because there's just dreams. Like my hope, dream, and desire, like I said, it was a Corvette Stingray or a Ferrari. I don't get too worked up when those things don't happen because it's a dream. I've kind of come to terms that's not going to happen. But if it were to ever become an expectation, I start to be disappointed when I open my garage. When things in our box that we hoped and dreamed about with our spouse turns into expectations, it becomes a burden on our spouse. And the more those expectations go unmet, what happens is our focus goes from outward more to inward. It goes to, how can I love my spouse better? These are just things we're hoping and dreaming and we're talking about and we're having fun. To the focus goes inward. These are expectations now. Why aren't these things being met? I expect to budget. I expect to do these things. Why aren't these things happening? And what I've seen happen more often than I can count is that couples, they get so focused inward that they feel like they only have a few choices. One of them is this, is that we leave and we pack up our box and we take it to the next relationship with us. And rather than dealing with the expectations, we just take it to the next relationship. And if that doesn't work, we take it to the next relationship until we find someone who can meet all of our expectations, which is no wonder why the divorce rate is higher for the second marriage than it is the first. And it's even higher for the third marriage than it is the second, because we didn't deal with the root problem. So we leave. The other option is we win, which is great if you're the one winning, because maybe you've convinced or you controlled or you coerced your spouse into thinking that your box is the one to operate out of. But what we forget in the process is that they have a box as well. So we convince them that our box is the one to operate out of. If we win, the other one loses. And I'm telling you, this may work for a year or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, but at some point something's going to happen, and the person who is never winning is finally going to say, I've had enough. I don't want to keep losing in this relationship. And not only that, but when expectations are constantly being met and we're the ones that are winning, we're the ones where it's all our expectations being met, this is what happens, is gratitude begins to disappear. Because if we expect something, we don't show as much gratitude with stuff. For example, if you owed me $100 and you gave me $100, I would say, okay, great, like debt paid. But if you just gave me a gift of $100, like there's a different amount of gratitude that's being showed, right? There's a difference between expectation and just receiving something. You show a different level of gratitude with it. And then the third thing is we compromise. Now, this one seems like the best option, doesn't it? This is maybe the most common solution for us. It sounds like the best option. We think the word compromise, and we naturally think win-win. We both win. You might win a little bit here. I might win a little bit here. But what compromising can tend to lead to is scorekeeping. And I'm just telling you, when scorekeeping enters the equation, intimacy always loses. When we begin to scorekeep and we begin to keep track of, okay, we were at your family's house for Thanksgiving 3 hours last year, and my house for 2 hours, so we're going to even the score this week. Or you bought all those clothes, I get to buy this fishing pole if I want to. You see how scorekeeping can become a thing? When scorekeeping starts to become part of the equation, intimacy always loses. So the question is there another way? What do we do with our boxes? Because chances are our boxes are filled with good things. These are things that make up who we are, who God designed us to be. The things in our boxes aren't necessarily bad, so throwing them out isn't an option. But what do we do with our boxes? How do we prevent our boxes from becoming expectations? How do we keep them hopes, dreams, and desires? So to answer this question, I want to look at one of the best and maybe one of the most controversial passages in the Bible about marriage. So I'm going to teach for just a couple minutes on this passage because this passage, maybe more than most others, has been taken out of context way too often. The passage is in Ephesians 5:21 through 25. It says this. I'll read the whole thing and then we'll go through it piece by piece. It says, "And further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. For wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything. For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church." We'll come back to that in a second. "He gave up his life for her. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man who loves his wife actually shows love for himself." So before we get into the application of this passage and how it applies to expectations, I want to talk about this part for just a moment. Because when I read this, some of you ladies, your skin began to crawl. Where it says, for wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And the reason your skin began to crawl is maybe you saw your dad just take advantage of your mom your whole childhood. You saw him walk all over her. Maybe it was a friend who, they just used this verse to excuse misogyny. They used this verse to excuse dominance in a relationship. And you just saw this verse not go so well. See, this verse is taken out of context more and more than maybe any other verse out there. My wife and I were in the process of moving, and I'm going through these boxes, and there was this box of old books that she had when she was growing up, and in there was, I forget the title of the book, but there was this book for like wives, and someone probably gave it to her when we were engaged or something. But this book, I was just kind of flipping through it because we were like figuring out what to keep, what to throw out. And as I'm flipping through it, it was a book teaching girls how to submit to their husbands. And this is some of the stuff that this book said. That gave an example of a husband yelling about an oil change, and it said the wife should always apologize. It said if you were to move into a new house and you as the wife don't like it, you voice your opinion once and then you submit. It says if you are ever to enter a contract and you as the wife knows that it will ruin them financially, you just submit. You don't say a thing. And it literally says that the wife has the final say about decorating in the home. Like, awesome. Like, the guys get to choose everything, but she gets to choose decorating. See, the problem with this verse is that it's taken out of context. Verse 22 cannot be separated from verse 21, and this is why. In the original Greek, this word does not appear. In the original Greek, the two verses are put together. Now, this isn't necessarily wrong, and this is why. Because in Greek, if the verb is in the first phrase, it can be assumed in the passages afterwards. So how this verse technically reads in the Greek is this: and further submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. For wives, this means to your husbands as to the Lord. But the problem is people begin to take this verse on its own and say, for wives, this means submit to your husbands. But it cannot be separated from verse 21. And further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see how that changes everything? If you take those two verses together, it's communicating a completely different thing. And by the way, it addresses the husband later on. How does it say for husbands to love their wives? As Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He died for her. He sacrificed himself for the church, and sacrifice is the ultimate form of submission. So the verse that holds the entire passage together is this one: and further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So the message is entitled, What Happy Couples Know, and this is what happy couples know, and you could fill this in, is that marriage is a submission competition. Maybe in a word we use more today, marriage is a serving competition with the goal of trying to outserve each other. So back to the boxes for just a moment. What does this all mean, practically speaking? This means as Christians, we are as best as we can to operate out of our spouse's boxes. This means we need to operate out of our spouse's box of hopes, dreams, and desires, even if they have become expectations. A practical thing, you can start small and just ask, how can I surprise my spouse by serving them today? How can I'm telling you, have fun with your spouse. If you're both here, try to outserve each other. And I'm just telling you, you will become a happier couple. Now, obviously the attitude matters. If we do this out of exhaustion and we just throw our hands up like, I can't do this anymore, I'm just going to keep the peace in the family, I will operate out of their box, we're just going to stay exhausted. We're going to remain exhausted. But if we do it, as the verse says, out of reverence for Christ, things will change. if we do it joyfully out of submission, we'll not only be obeying God, but I believe it can lead to a happier marriage. See, watch what happens. As we begin to operate out of our spouse's box, it will start to turn from expectations back into hopes, dreams, and desires. And not only that, but their focus goes from inward back to outward, because they're going to feel love on a whole different level. Their focus is going to go back towards you. Now, the question I know a lot of you are asking is, why do I have to go first? Like my spouse, maybe your spouse isn't even here today, and you're thinking, why do I have to go first? And the reason is because Jesus modeled this for us. Romans 5:8, our memory verse for today. It says, but God demonstrates his own love for us. A demonstration of his love is this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He died for us regardless of whether or not we ever do anything for him. So start operating out of your spouse's box. See what happens. Give it 2 weeks. See what happens. Begin operating out of things that your wife, your husband always dreamed of doing, dreamed of having, whether it could be as simple as a budget. You've always been against budgeting, but you know that's important to your spouse, so you decide, we're going to do it your way this month. It could be anything. Think of ways to practically serve your spouse. So a little bit of homework for you this morning. If you notice, there weren't next steps on your message notes. I'm just going to give them to you right in the message this week. So first one, if you're married and you're both here, go on a date over the next couple weeks. And what I want you to do, I want you to share what is inside of your box, because chances are when you were dating, when you were engaged, you had this conversation before. We all had the conversation of how many kids we wanted and what we hoped for the future. But chances are when we're dating, because we're showing the best part of ourselves, we're talking about the things that make us look good. Like we always dreamed of going to Paris and stuff like that. But when was the last time we had this conversation? When was the last time we went a little bit deeper than the surface and we talked about some deep hopes, dreams, and desires? And just go on a date, and if your spouse is talking, just listen to what they say. This is the problem. This is what I always do wrong. My wife will share her hopes, dreams, and desires, and I begin to think about it too logically, and right away, I start to say how it's not possible. Oh no, we can't go to Europe. That costs too much money. No, that'll never happen. And what happens is she begins to shut down, and she just doesn't share too much more. So rather than trying to run it through logic, just listen. Chances are they're not going to expect everything that comes out of their mouth. So if you're married and if you're both here, do that. Make a list of 5, share them with each other. If you're married and you're the only one here, and maybe your spouse wants nothing to do with church and they won't listen to the message online, I would encourage you to go on a date and ask her about their hopes, dreams, and desires. With no expectation of you sharing anything in return, just ask them to share with you what they hope for, what they dream for in the future, because that will give you a box to begin operating out of. And I just believe that if we begin to do that, at some point the focus goes from inward to outward, and they will begin to ask us what's in our box as well. If you're single, make a list on your own. What are things that you want for your future? What are the important things to you? And then as you begin dating, you'll have a list that you can hold people to, because again, you see the best of someone while you're dating them. And if there's some red flags right off the bat, your hopes, dreams, and desires are complete opposite, you can know, okay, this is something I'm willing to compromise on. This is something that's too important to me. If you're dating or if you're engaged, I would say don't let another month go by without having this conversation. I had someone ask me one time, they were dating and they wanted couples counseling. And I said, here's my counseling, just break up. If you need counseling this early, it's not a good sign. So if you're dating, don't let another month go by. And remember, this is not an overnight thing. My wife and I, we are not perfect at this. There's times that we score keep. We tend to lean towards compromise sometimes when things are going wrong. But more times than not, we are always trying to outserve each other. We are always trying to outsubmit to each other. And this is what was happened. Our boxes started out pretty different. The big things were very similar, but a lot of the smaller, minor things were pretty different. Over time, over submitting to each other and out of operating and serving each other, our boxes began to look more and more similar to each other's. There's not that big of a difference between them. So we don't necessarily know whose box we're operating out of. See, after 8.5 years of marriage, I'm telling you, this has helped us to be closer together. This has helped intimacy in our relationship. This has helped us to have a more fulfilling marriage than we could have ever imagined. So would you pray with me? Father, we know that we have some expectations in our lives. There are things that maybe we've expected from our spouse, and God, we know that they've become a burden. So God, I ask that you would just help to reveal what those are so that we can ease the burden on our spouse. And we can keep them in their proper box of hopes, dreams, and desires. And God, I ask that you would just help us to all have the courage to go first. To go first in our family, to begin to discover what's in our spouse's box. Maybe it's something we've known for a long time, but now we're going to take the step and begin operating out of it. God, I pray that you would help us to go first. And for all the married couples that are in here, God, I just pray that this would become a fun exercise. God, that we can begin to try to outserve each other, to outsubmit to each other. God, believing that our intimacy will grow, that our relationship will grow, that our fulfillments will grow. God, we thank you. In your name we pray. Amen.